Hey everyone, and welcome to Beyond the Raise podcast, where we get under the hood of founder scaling stories. Will and I are here with brand strategist Kelli Corney. Welcome to the podcast, Kelli.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
More than welcome. Nice to have you. So today we're going to be talking a bit of a different angle, which is why I think Will and I were so excited to get you on. We're going to be looking at how most scaling problems are more often than not positioning problems in disguise. So I think we'll just get straight into it. And normally, like we like to start with setting the scene a little bit in terms of, tell us a little bit about you and what you do and what's got you to this point.
Yeah, cool. So like you said, I'm a brand strategist. I've done a lot of different things. I currently run an independent strategy studio, and I started my career working in media for big companies like NBC Universal, CNBC, the Financial Times. And then I kind of moved more into the consulting side, where I've worked with early stage startups all the way to some of the biggest brands in the world. I also co-founded a climate tech accelerator at the University of Oxford. So I've had the interesting position of sort of being on many sides of the coin. I've been on the founder's side, on the sort of deep tech area, and I've been a founder myself. So I have a good perspective of sort of what that journey is like, as well as the people who kind of try to help founders along the way.
Great. So you've got a good perspective in terms of what works, what doesn't work, what to do and what not to do from this angle as well, which is great.
I hope so. I mean, I think interestingly, you might look at that and say these are a lot of disconnected things, but I feel like the fundamental tie in why I do what I do is I'm just fascinated by people and culture and what moves us. Like, why do we care about the things that we do? What makes us actually take action? And there's usually some kind of really interesting, essential truth that sits behind all of that stuff, which often ends up being the building block that leads to great products and great companies and businesses that, how we even run our businesses and how we try to tell the story to connect that to the people that we want to connect with. So yeah, I mean, I'd like to think I have a pretty strong bullshit meter where I'm quite good at filtering out what's, often I feel like you get a bunch of smart people in a room. Everyone wants to talk to each other and feel great about how smart we all sound. But you kind of have to be able to pull that back and say okay, what are we actually talking about here? What really matters? And bring it back to that very simple thing that people do connect with.
I want to sort of get into what actually changes after the raise, right? Obviously, we're called Beyond the Raise. So what do you think genuinely changes for a company once the funding lands?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much you could say, right? But I think the biggest one is it just turns up the volume. Suddenly there are a lot more people that need to get you really fast. You've got new hires, you're trying to find new customers, you're talking to the press, you're maybe trying to get partners on board, investors. And there's it just ends up being this tipping point where you can no longer, as the founder, be in every room explaining what the company does. And that is really hard for a lot of people. It's hard to let go of that, and it's hard to kind of move on to what's next. So that's where brand comes in, because it's the thing that just helps you to explain or explains on your behalf what you do when you're not there. And after a raise, in the early stages, you as the founder do so much of that storytelling. It's your charisma, your ability to get investors on board that pulls the company forward. And then suddenly you have 40 employees and you have to rely on them to do that for you. And people just tend to get kind of stuck here. And weirdly, I feel, I don't know if you guys have seen this or if other people have said this, but I feel like there's this tipping point that happens at around 20 people. Once you get above that to 30, 40 employees, it feels like this palpable shift. And you have to start to learn how to decode all of those things that you intuitively do as a founder and that have made the company really appealing, and translate that to the rest of your team. Actually trust people, hand that over and get them to deliver the message too. And so I think what gets confused here is everyone starts to focus so much on, okay, now that we've raised, the job is just to scale the product. But the real job is to scale the understanding or the desire for the product. What value does this really bring to people, and how do I make that simple to understand?
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I'd completely agree around that 2030 mark. I remember in my previous company when we were working, it was out in Singapore, but we were working, and up to the 20 mark, it was just great fun. Everybody knew everyone. There wasn't, too much politics in the office. It was just some of the best times and best moments and memories for me. And then post that just everything changed. Out of necessity, you have to have policies in place, other things, team structures start to develop where they weren't before. And so, yeah, looking back, that was a really fond moment. So I would definitely agree that is, I think, a quite common tipping point from a critical mass to then, second stage ultimately. And
Yeah, when I was building my agency, we would always say, like, we feel like we're almost a different company every 6 months. You're like really reinventing yourself quite a bit when you're growing at that pace. So it's an interesting thing to like take stock and be like, wow, we really feel quite different than we did even just 6 months ago.
yeah, absolutely. And what do you think founders consistently underestimate at this stage?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes back to what I was just saying, how when you don't have that story straight, when you have kind of a fuzzy story about your product, or you're not quite sure how to translate that beyond you as the founder, it actually does compound in real cost when you're starting to like hire and sell at speed. So, I'm working with a fintech right now that's post-raise. And I had a meeting recently where we sort of asked everyone, sit down and write on a Post-it note. Don't tell anyone, but just like if you had to answer the question, what does your company do? What do you do? In one sentence, what is it? And everyone had a different answer. So, you can figure this out quite quickly if you ask, 10 of your customers or employees, what do you do? And you get 10 different answers back. You have a positioning problem. Or if you can't easily explain what you do to me in one sentence. And I think the important part of that is like, oh yeah, of course, you want everyone kind of saying the same thing within the company. But if you don't define this, other people will do it for you. And it's not necessarily going to be in a way that you like.
Yeah, completely agree. We had a conversation last week, a couple of weeks ago, maybe, with a company, and they were saying exactly that. So it's really hard to find the balance between explaining something in the level of detail that you need for people to understand what you're doing, but not getting so technical and lost in the details that then, a layman isn't going to understand it or is going to get lost in the detail. And sometimes, especially with founders, the detail is their baby. They're fascinated by the story, the product, whatever it is that they're doing. And sometimes you can probably over-explain it because you understand it in such a high level. And that perhaps can, it gets diluted, get lost and get confusing along the way, right?
It's funny too. I feel like people get this imposter syndrome when you're in a business environment or you're in a professional environment, right? And I'm like, oh, tell me about your company. What do you do? You'll go on this multi-paragraph, 10-minute rant. But if you're sitting at the pub with a friend and they're like, hey, tell me about your new company, you're like, oh, it's this, and you say it in one sentence. So I sometimes will do this thing I call the pub test with people where I'm like, okay, pretend that you're at a pub with a friend. You have to say it in the simplest possible way to me. I'm not in your industry. I'm not in your business. I'm not a business person. Just talk to me like a normal person. And you can kind of start to pull things out where you're like, okay, that's it. You just said it so simply. That's the one thing.
So interesting. So in one of my last businesses, we did two things. It was, what's your one-liner when you're in a pub? And someone says, what do you do? And what's your 30-second elevator pitch? And we drove that into everyone. So, everyone has to have their own style, their own way of portraying and communicating it. But what they're saying has to effectively be the same thing. And you ask everyone in the room, that person would walk away going, basically, I get what you do. That's really interesting you say at the pub test. I've not heard it called that, but we used to do that. And it does work really, really well for sure. Okay, great. So I'm really interested in like the risk element in terms of what founders maybe ignore in terms of positioning and getting under the hood of that a little bit more. So I guess in terms of founders focus on product and growth first generally, but what important thing do you feel tends to get ignored?
Yeah, this is an interesting conversation because all you hear up until your raise and then after is growth, 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 right? Like it's so important to get to the point where you can make that raise. And as soon as you have it, this like impending doom pressure comes onto you where you're like, wow, we really have to move things forward. So everyone obsesses with growth. And that game has just changed a lot in the last 5-10 years. Growth hacking, growth titles have been really popular, but you can't really operate like that anymore. The days of growth hacking are over because it kind of was born from this era where you could like buy ads cheaply, target people online. And, we all get very lured in by this ability to track data and metrics and make that mean something. But because ads are expensive now, because, the gig is kind of up on finding customers cheaply online and the world is just so oversaturated with so much of it now. It's like, it's a game that you can't win anymore. So growth actually is more comprehensive than that. Like you have to think about your brand and you have to think about what you mean to people. And, I think when you say like, I'm a brand strategist, those are two words that people just zone out the second you say them. Like, what is a strategist and what does brand mean? They're kind of just nonsense words because they've been repeated so much. And, even if I asked you guys, like, what do you think a brand is? Like, people will give you very, very different answers back. It's this sort of ephemeral thing. So I think you kind of have to delete that word and just be like, brand is a nonsense word. The sort of very simple understanding of it is someone designs a logo or a color palette for me, and like, that's what represents my company. But it's something much bigger than that. It's actually sort of the soul of what you're doing, the soul of your company. And there are a lot of different definitions for brand. One that I quite like is it's what people say about you when you're not in the room. But I think my personal definition is that your brand is just the truth. It's just, what's true about what you do? What's that essential thing? And how do you connect that with people in ways that make them feel something? Good brands make you feel something.
Yeah. Absolutely. We can all think of those brands where you've got in like back in mind either from childhood or something that just sticks in a completely different way. You're so right. And then what are you seeing, generally that founders just sort of get wrong about telling like their own product story? Are there sort of themes that you're seeing that just consistently come up?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple different ways of looking at this. I think first it goes back to what I said is kind of my personal motivation for doing this work is a really critical part of building a good brand is being able to deeply understand your customer's real lived experience and clearly articulating the problems they either knowingly or unknowingly need a solution for. And this is kind of a difficult thing to get to. It's a lot harder than it sounds. And another little test that I like to use or an exercise is the why test. So you kind of just say like, okay, well, why does someone need this product? They need it for this reason. Well, why do they need that? Right? You keep asking why. It's like a little kid being like, why?
Yeah.
Why do you do that? You just keep doing that until you get down to the most essential thing, which is fear of death. Which I know sounds kind of dramatic, but at the end of the day, it's just like the most motivating thing that anyone has in their life. And when you follow that chain, you can be like, okay, now I sort of see where this might actually matter to someone in their lives. Another way of looking at, so that's kind of like the deeper underlying motivation that it can be difficult for people to articulate to you, but it's like an essential truth to understand about what you do. And then the second is like, you should be able to explain what you do to somebody, explain the problem you solve, to a non-technical person. And the best way of thinking about that is like, explain it to me like I'm a bored but smart teenager. It's got to be simple enough that I can get it and it's going to hold my attention, but also like I'm intelligent, right? You don't have to treat me like a child.
Mm.
And, technical founders tend to lead with how novel their tech is. What actually gets somebody interested is showing the painful problem you remove and what it's costing them.
Mm.
So a way to think about this, and, people may have heard of this before, is vitamin versus painkiller. Have you guys ever come across this? Yeah. So it's a nice mechanism to be like, painkillers are the must-haves, vitamins are the nice-to-haves. You are really motivated if you have a migraine to find some medicine to stop that, right? Because it's like a real pain that you're feeling that you need to get rid of. And it's like a short-term fix it for me now, whereas vitamins are sort of a longer-term fix. They're nice to have. They help with long-term maintenance, or they might be preventative. And it's not that either is bad, but you kind of want to know whether you're a vitamin or a painkiller and figure out how to speak to the problem you solve based on that. An example that I think helps flesh this out a little bit is I had somebody, when I was running the accelerator, one of the founders who had a deep tech company was really challenging me back on this and was like, I don't need a brand. My tech is really novel. The thing that I'm building, no one else is doing it. It's brand new. Why do I need a brand? It's just like, it speaks for itself. It just sounds like a bunch of extra, but that's only true for so long, right? Like your tech being novel doesn't last forever. It's not a moat. Other people are already studying you. There's probably other companies emerging around the same time that will do something different than you are. And, you've got to get ahead of that. So one of the examples that this founder brought up, they were like, well, think about ChatGPT. And this was a couple of years ago when it was like first really the big AI platform that everyone was using. And they're like, ChatGPT doesn't need a brand. Like everyone uses it. It's the only thing that you talk about, right? But we know that that's not true. But today we have Claude, we have all of these other AI tools, and it's a crowded field. And those brands are really starting to separate themselves out now by the stories that they tell and how they kind of show up in the world. And some are earning a lot more trust than others. And it's been an interesting thing to watch play out. So it's a good example of just how, tech isn't novel forever, and it is something you need to be thinking about.
I think that's such a good point, that tech isn't novel forever. I've not really thought about that before, but you're so right. And I think, the chat GPT and the AI is a great example where, we use it in the business all day, every day for lots of different things, for efficiencies, for help with certain stuff, for information. But when it first came out, it was mind blowing. This thing that now it's just something that we use every day. So don't even think about it. It's such a valid point that I've never really thought about it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's a lot of things you could say about all of the various platforms, but like ChatGPT is kind of becoming the Microsoft, and Claude is becoming the Apple, and Claude has been doing Anthropic, has been doing some really interesting brand activations where they're trying to humanize what they're doing. I don't know if you guys have seen, but they did a coffee pop-up and they gave people hats that just said thinking on them, because their whole position is around like, it's a tool that helps you think. It doesn't replace your thinking. It's the tool for smart people, right? So they're really starting to carve that out. And you can even see by the people who use these different tools and the industries that use them, which are gravitating towards which ones. And those are signals for you of like how these brands are being built and what they stand for.
One question for you, Kelly. It's slightly off topic, if you don't mind. Well, it's on topic, but it's perhaps off piste. So we had someone on recently, just talking on that theme of storytelling, right? Which is obviously something you're very experienced in. We had someone on recently that was saying, just talking around the transition from a company when they are new, all of their storytelling has to revolve around being novel, being breakthrough, being interesting and something different. And then they go through this transition where, not always, it depends on the type of financing they're seeking, but specifically if they're trying to pursue debt financing, they have to then also make this very big transition into seemingly being kind of very investable, very risk-free, very boring almost, and right for project finance investment. So how do you marry that? That's a kind of almost a real juxtaposition of story and it's not overnight, but it seems to be quite close in a company's journey. How would you address that? Sorry to throw that on you, but I think
no, it's really interesting. I mean, it's a great tension to point out, and there are it's hard to say from the outside looking in without knowing like what the exact product is, but the kinds of questions I would ask to get to something, like you basically want a through line between those things, right? Because like you said, first you want to say this is genuinely novel and interesting. Then you have to prove longevity at the same time. I mean, sometimes that can be the same argument. Sometimes novelty is like, this industry is on its way down. This new thing is coming in and it's going to start to take it over, right? You've got those bell curves that happen in industries. So, there are different ways of kind of honing in on that story. Sometimes it's that the customer that you serve is essentially different, or that demographic or that mindset is changing in a way that's going to make it have more longevity. You kind of want to start to deconstruct what are the elements of either who your product serves, what white space it fills in the market, what is sort of, what that novelty serves, and how is it going to create something that sticks for people. I know it's a little bit of a vague answer, but there are a bunch of questions that I would like, if we were sitting down and having a conversation, I would say, I'm going to ask you these like 20 questions and then we'll figure out what it is.
Right. Okay.
I think, does that make sense as an answer? I mean, I think it's like, you've got to find what the through line between those two things are.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's like a shared mindset between people. A lot of times companies will say, we're for this type of business or this type of person. And it's often like they're at this stage in life or they have this kind of company or whatever. But often there's like a mindset that's shared among groups of people that sort of transcends demographics or other sorts of markers that makes it appealing either for longer term or for more types of people, which gives it more longevity and more staying power.
Okay. That's good. Really interesting. So to shift gears slightly, to talk about kind of the brand backbone and I guess the two meanings of culture. If a founder only had a week to work on this, where would you suggest that they start?
Cool. So there are a lot of different ways of doing brand strategy, lots of different approaches. There's no like one right way. But I find that with early stage and post-raise companies, you just need to keep it simple. And there's a framework I like to use that works really well. It's the 3 Ps: purpose, position, and personality. And I would suggest just taking time out and really thinking through each of these and trying to get something on paper. I teach a course on maven.com, which just walks people through this. It's like a crash course for founders for 2 weeks. And we just sit down and work through it. So you've got this like We call it minimum viable brand to sort of start with and run your business. You can always iterate on it. You can always hand it over to an agency at some point and say, help me with this. Just, if you can just dedicate the time to do that with your team, with just a couple of people, whatever, it'll get you really far. But let's break down and talk about what those things actually mean, because again, this can all sound a little bit difficult to wrap your head around until you sort of get into like, okay, what are actually the elements of creating a brand? So let's start with purpose. Purpose is the change you want to see in the world, irrespective of financial gain. It is why people root for you. And it's, directly after a raise, kind of the best recruiting tool that you have. The way that this often sounds is we exist to blank. People can only ever remember one thing. It's easy to get caught up in what's our mission, vision, values. That's all stuff that can come later down the line. If you can just articulate a clear purpose, that will get you so much further. So like I said, it's the change you want to see in the world, irrespective of financial gain. It's why you do what you do. It plays a big role in getting people to come work for you. It makes people feel a part of something bigger than just the day-to-day. So, some examples of purpose statements: Nike, to bring inspiration, we exist to blank, bring inspiration and innovation to every athlete in the world. And if you have a body, you are an athlete. Google's is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. So it's not what you do, it's why anyone should care about what you do. And I think this is particularly important for companies in climate. It often gets confused with your position. So, because you're like, well, we're a sustainable company. So, that's why people should buy our product. That's our purpose. We work in climate. That's what do we need to say beyond that? And it's true. Like, it can be part of your purpose, but it isn't ultimately the main reason people buy your product. People are inherently selfish. You need to fulfill that selfish need as much as you need to fulfill the aspirational one. And the purpose usually needs to go a step beyond just we are a climate company. That is table stakes now for a lot of consumers and businesses. So you've got to show beyond that. So let's next shift to position. Position is the space you own in your customer's mind. So this kind of goes back to the thing we said before. When you ask 10 people what you do and they give you 10 different answers, defining your position is what will create a singular answer to that. So an example of this is, I'm just going to use the fintech company again that I'm working with right now. It's interesting because they're in an established world of fintech, but the sort of category that they inhabit is quite new. So the interesting thing is they often get very siloed about who their competitors are. And when you are building a new product, when you're in an emerging category or you have a new tech, that competitive set is often also quite small and probably also not many people have heard of them before. So you end up looking at all of your competitors. What are they saying? What are they doing? How am I better than them? That actually doesn't matter yet. You're like too narrow. What you're actually competing against is the old way of doing things or what behavior people are doing now. And that's actually a lot more important to take on than the other people who are trying to break through and do the same thing that you're doing. So a good example of this is like Google Calendar. When they first launched, Outlook already existed, right? Like there were other digital calendars that existed, but they didn't say, we're better than Microsoft. They positioned against paper diaries because that's how most people were still keeping track of their calendars. So it's an interesting way to reframe where do you sit in the market? How do you talk about your product? You hear a lot of like, we're the Uber of this, or we're the whatever, sort of pulling from another company that does something like you. When you're truly innovating and you're in a new category, you have to think about what are people doing today and how do I say this is how we're going to do this differently. The difference between purpose and position is, purpose is more of a long-term thing. That should be true for like the next 10 years of your company. It's the reason you exist, right? So it's like a longer term thing that you're aiming towards. Whereas position is something that, especially in the beginning, is usually more tied to the function that your product actually provides people or like what your product does. And it's more functional. The purpose is the more emotional side. Why do we exist? Why do people care? And the position is more, what space do we occupy? How are we actually useful to people? How do they think about what we do? And then the last thing is personality. So this is just like how you show up in the world. It's what do you look like? How do you speak? It's the thing that gives you a point of view that people can connect with and makes your company feel human and relatable. So like An easy way to think about this is, if your company was a person, what would they be like? And I think, I don't know if you guys agree with me, but the most interesting people I know, the most interesting brands I come in contact with, they have this sense of tension to them. A knee jerk when you think about personalities, people just tend to say a lot of words that sound the same. We're trustworthy, we're reliable, we're this. But actually, you're just saying the same thing over and over again, and it doesn't really mean anything to anyone. Like when I think about my friends and the people that I think are like most interesting to me, it's the friend who like is super fashionable and always on the next trend or whatever, but they just like, they only like old music, right? Like there's something in there. There's this tension between new and old where you're like, well, that's so interesting. Like what makes this person attracted to these things? And good brands do that too. Oatly, everyone's familiar. It's a one that people talk about often in the brand world, but I think it's interesting because it's also a bit of a sustainable company as well. So might be more relevant to this audience. But, an oat milk company, it's a sustainable product in a lot of ways. And you expect that, a product in sustainability is going to be preachy, worthy, like all of those things that people kind of default to, but it's really the opposite of that. It's weird. It's self-deprecating. It's like deliberately a little bit annoying. And that tension is really attractive. It's like unexpected, it is doing this great thing for the world, but it's like weird and kind of uncomfortable sometimes. And that's what makes you like it. So personality is what gives you that sort of appeal to people. It's how you really connect and feel real. And, it's arguably the most sort of the least KPI driven of all the things we've just talked about, but it's the thing that makes people care about you and want to interact with you.
Yeah.
So
I was just going to say, I could completely agree. I mean, there's just so many kind of faceless, soulless corporate companies out there, right? They just get lost in a sea of them all. Then, FMCG company that for me kind of ticks that box is Innocent. And then equally Ryanair. I don't know if you follow Ryanair, but their kind of brand strategy is almost just taking the piss out of their customers. And it's very edgy. And it's not going to work for everyone, but it's, as you say, it's just like, this is us, this is who we're going to be. So kind of owning it, but it works. They stay in your mind then.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be weird, right? Like you can be in a really weird category and be a very serious brand. Like there are a lot of different ways to create tension, but the interesting thing is just like trying to create things that are a little bit of opposites that come together in a way that creates a little bit of magic and makes things feel ownable.
Okay, excellent. And how does brand connect to culture?
Yeah. Big question. But again, let's break this down into a couple of different things. So first is maybe internal culture at a company, and then we'll talk about like wider culture in the world. So having clarity about your brand is really the cheapest kind of cultural infrastructure you can create post-raise. And interestingly, almost no one treats it that way. It always feels like it's a customer-driven thing. But like we said before, purpose aligns not just like why people should want to come work for you, but who you hire. Personality tells your team how to show up when you're not in the room. And that keeps a really fast-growing company telling one story and attracting people who are going to create a cohesive internal culture. And the other thing is like after you raise, you're suddenly competing for really senior talent. Like you can hire all those people you couldn't afford before. And comp isn't always the thing that wins here, right? Like you're often trying to convince people to come from higher paying jobs to work for you. And what does that, right? They have to feel like that clarity of purpose and people feeling a part of something bigger, wanting to be a part of a story that they believe in, that they understand, especially in climate, you're often like hiring these mission-driven people who their motivation isn't just money. And they can choose to fulfill that in a lot of different ways. So, if you can say exactly what change you're making, why it matters, you'll get the best people. It really helps with that recruitment. And I guess where we transition this into wider culture is, it's not just about being clear about what you do, but it's about being relevant and plugging into conversations people are having in the world, things that people care about. And there's this quote that I love from a big sort of ad world academic piece that was put together in the early 2000s called the Clue Train Manifesto. And it talks about how influential, brands and stories are. And the quote is, if markets are conversations, brands have to be interesting conversationalists, which is so true. There's this example I like to use when I talk to people about this a lot, which is like, Elon Musk tweeted about Tesla and about Twitter, and the stock like tanked the next day, saying he thought it was overvalued before he owned it, right? This is a little while ago. And I found this tweet of this guy being like, dude, you just lost me 10K, right? Like just saying something can kind of move the markets. So if you can tap into those conversations and things that are interesting to people happening in the world, it's really powerful. Like, it is actually how the economy runs. The market is just people's feelings, right? Like, there's this economist whose work I follow really closely. Her name's Kyla Scanlon, and she does a lot of talking about the attention economy. And we live in a world now where attention is both drives the economy, but it's genuinely scarce. We're often competing for seconds of it. So like, stories are the thing that actually win, and it has real material influence on what happens in the world. She coined this term. Well, actually, I don't think she coined it, but she often uses the term vibe session. Have you guys heard that? Where it's like the recession is just kind of the vibes that people feel. So like, last year when the economy, everyone had this like doom feeling about the economy. It's like really bad. But when you take a hard look at the numbers, they actually weren't as bad as people felt. And it's, and then that causes people to spend less, and then the gloom becomes real. So perception doesn't just sit on top of reality. It actually creates the reality. It causes people to act in a certain way. And in an attention economy, the story is the product. Like, perception is actually what the market trades on. There's another interesting example of this, not in the climate world at all, but did you guys see the Sydney Sweeney American Eagle Good Genes ad? No. Okay. This one was huge. It blew up. It was a very controversial ad that went out. And it basically, over the course of one day, it increased the market cap to 200 million in a single day of trading just on attention, because they put out this like very controversial thing from a brand that people weren't used to hearing from in that way. And interestingly, sales didn't follow too much because it was just trying to hack that attention in a short-term way. So I think the cautionary tale here is, even though the story is important, you have to actually back that up with the product. Like, if you can grab people's attention short-term, that's only half the game. The product actually has to deliver. So vibes can dominate kind of short-term, but eventually those fundamentals are important. And I think it just goes back to this thing where, like, I'm such a firm believer in this. And even though I think sometimes when you talk about brand and story and all this stuff, it starts to sound like, oh, you're just creating this like big sales thing to lure people in, and it feels like a trick. People don't want to be tricked. There's so much cynicism around marketing and brand, and it all comes from this. It feels like there's just these like very smart people trying to trick me into doing things. And we're past that. Like, you can no longer survive on just story alone. You have to kind of back that up. Another interesting example is Everlane, built a brand on radical transparency, a fashion brand. They just sold their company to Shein, which is the complete opposite of that, right? The evil demon of fast fashion. So that completely undermined the story that they've been telling for years and years. And, lots of people immediately flocked to social media to say, like, we're boycotting Everlane. It's dead now. So interesting one to stay tuned to see what happens on. But this stuff is always evolving in real time. And it just shows you kind of the flip side of that coin. Yes, we live in an attention economy. Yes, you want to tap into cultural conversations that matter, but you can't do it at the expense of having integrity of your product matching up to what you say. It's got to fulfill both sides of that.
Yeah. It's a really interesting point as well. So it's a bit different, but we had a guest on a few weeks ago who they are effectively producing a more sustainable brick out of recycled materials. But because of the process it has to go through in terms of washing it, storage, logistics, it's actually more expensive than a standard brick, but it's recycled. And when we sort of got under the hood a little bit more with him, we sort of said, actually, do you find that most potential clients are really into it until they see the price and then they fall away? He's like, yeah, 99%. Because we're not big enough yet so we can do it at a more affordable price. But people are effectively just focused on the price at the end of the day. And to your example a minute ago, they've been telling a good story, but then they've been offered a very good price for their business and gone, well, yeah, I'll just take that, which is a shame to hear. But
this
really common.
It's a perfect example, right? So, I mean, I can just ask both of you, like, has there ever been a time in your life when you've looked at two products functionally the same, but you buy the more expensive one? I'm sure it happens all the time, right? Like, I do it all the time. I like the packaging, like the reason. And that is exactly the role brand plays. Two products, exactly the same price. One might even be more expensive. A classic example of this is an iPhone and an Android, depending on where you are in the world. But let's say in the UK, I'm American. In the US, majority of people have iPhones, right? Arguably a worse product, sort of function-wise, depending on what those functionality you want is. More expensive, yet we all want them. Why? Brand is the thing that makes something more appealing to you. whether that's because of what it stands for, what it says about the type of person that you are because you own this thing, or it's just appealing to you in some way. It feels like it fits into your life. It feels like the kind of thing you want to surround yourself with. And yeah, that's, I think that comes up a lot with sustainable companies. Another company that I worked with for a while, they are quite similar to the brick company you mentioned. They are creating a new material to kind of help replace plastic, and exactly the same problem. Most of their conversations with customers were about, well, but you're more expensive. It sounds great. You go through the whole thing. Perfect. We're sold. Oh, but it's more expensive. Well, we've got to think about it, right? So it's really what's in it. It's not just, what's in it for you, but like, what is it really adding to someone's life? Like, what is the end benefit for the customer that's going to make it significantly motivating? Like we said, people are fundamentally selfish. We want things that first and foremost fulfill a need that we have before we're willing to pay more for something or before we want to be sustainable.
Yeah.
For the most part, right? Sometimes you make decisions, but they're less often.
Yeah. It's a really complicated and complex match as well, because going back to your iPhone point, I mean, I'm that guy. Both my brothers have got Android. Will's got an Android. My brothers love telling me how much better their phone is at battery, but I just prefer the look of the Apple. So I've always just been Apple. So when you were saying that, I was like, yeah, do you know what? I'm 100% that person. And funny enough, me and my wife were talking the other day about, I know this is a little bit off topic, but brands that use celebrities to endorse whatever it is, like George Clooney does Nespresso. I love Nespresso. I've got an espresso machine. But the thing I can't get my head around, and because maybe it doesn't appeal to my type of person, but why does George Clooney being a part of that brand make people go, I'm going to buy that coffee? Because it doesn't for me at all, but it must do, because obviously a lot of companies use it and it must cost them an awful lot of money to get those people to be an ambassador for the brand or advertise their brand.
Yeah, I think it's like when people do that, when brands do that, it's often you're borrowing from that person. You're borrowing either the cultural cachet that they have, their own personal brand, the things that they stand for, and you're just aligning yourself with it. And you can do this with celebrities or influencers, right? Or you can do it with like collaborations with other companies. So partnerships, right? Like you grow through ecosystems, whether that's people, influencers, other companies. So who do you not compete with that you can align yourself with that will expand your audience and will be aligned with the type of people that you want to target? So if George Clooney, George Clooney's a great rep for a brand that wants to be sophisticated and, all of those things that you think he stands for. I want people to feel that about my brand, so I'm going to align it with him, right? So it's thinking about like, what's the layer deeper? What does this person kind of represent to us? Or what does this company represent or function it fills in my life? And then how do I align my product with that to kind of communicate things to people without having to really say them?
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, then. So when we were sort of talking before we were recording the podcast, we got into a few different topics about what might be interesting. And you raised something that I thought was interesting about, I think you sort of said, pick a villain, and then, about the brand traps that you can sort of fall into. Why is it a founder might ever want to be disliked?
Yeah, exactly. This is actually so important because all these things we're talking about, it all sounds great. Like, let's build a brand everyone loves. We want to reach as many people as possible. And that is the number one trap that people fall into. When you are for everyone, you are for no one, especially early stage, especially at this kind of like critical growth point for a company. You actually need to be quite narrow about who you're for. Because even if you just think about buying ads or how you're going to acquire your next customers, the amount of resources, time, energy, money you have to reach lots of various different people in different places, it's a losing battle. You want to win a small niche that's going to love you. And then you sort of grow one step at a time and widen that circle. So what comes along with that is deciding who you're for, but critically, it's also deciding who you're not for. And it's okay that not everyone's going to like you. Like that is actually the point. If you think about sort of traditional storytelling and your customer should be the hero of your brand, right? So if they're the hero, then who's the villain? You need to stand against something, not just for something. The thing you stand for is your purpose, what we just talked about. And that fear of alienating people is what often holds you back. Having a villain actually helps to rally people to a cause because there is recognition there. Like you're stating clearly something that people can feel but can't always articulate. And the bigger raise you have, the bigger the round, the stronger the pull is to please everyone, because you're like, oh my God, suddenly we have all this money. We're accountable to all these people. Really just don't want to mess it up. And the instinct is to do the thing that feels safe. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but actually having a villain, knowing what you fight against, knowing what you stand against is much safer than not having one. An example of a company that I worked with in the past is Purple Bricks, the estate agency company.
Yeah. And
they really didn't know what this was. And we got them to get clear on it. And it's like, everyone hates selling their home. You kind of hate dealing with estate agents. Like, it's not a pleasant experience. And it's because they give you this young person who's supposed to know more about your area than you, and you've got to pay them all this money. And you're like, I don't get it. I just feel like I could do this better myself, but there's this person in the way. That's this thing that I have to go through. So we took the villain, we sort of identified the villain for them was the lack of transparency in the industry. It's kind of this like Wizard of Oz man behind the curtain that feels like it's like the thing everyone doesn't like about the industry. And if you can sort of identify that and say, like, look, we're on your side. Like, we don't want to be those people. We're going to sort of remove those barriers for you. We're going to be about something else. That's a really powerful message. So it doesn't always have to be like an enemy in the industry, but if you can if you can rally people against something like that's what moves people to action. Like, that's what gets them to actually care about you beyond just, the functional purpose that you fulfill for somebody.
Yeah, I think Will and I, we've definitely gone through that journey with, the other business that we have. When you first set it up, you want to try and be everyone's best friend and work with everyone because, well, you need the money and you want the experience of doing so. But actually you learn quite quickly after trying to do that there are businesses or people that are just not quite the right fit for whatever it is you're trying to do and who you are today. And it's actually quite satisfying then realizing that and saying, do you know what? Wish you all the best, but we're not going to work with you. There's something quite liberating in that as well. Tough decision, tough to do at the start, but very, very liberating as well.
It also makes you weirdly attractive to people, right? Like the second you're like, well, I don't know if we're a good fit. Yeah. All of a sudden everyone's like, wait, why not? I want you to like me, right? So when you're in like a service-based business or whatever, that is quite an interesting dynamic where the clearer you are about who you're not for, the more people want to work with you.
Yeah.
Again,
counterintuitive,
like true.
Treat them mean, keep them keen. Seems to work for some reason. And then just putting it sort of specifically into sort of the climate piece, what are you seeing that founders just get wrong about brands specifically?
Yeah, I think we touched on this a little bit earlier, but, I often get asked, like, how do we get more people to care about climate? And I think that question in itself is the thing getting in the way. You don't win by moralizing or trying to convince people to care about an issue. Like we said, like the world is too noisy. Everyone's alarmed by every news cycle. Climate is such like a big existential problem to land. And at the product level, it's difficult to lead with a cause, like we already said. People just end up tuning it out. And sustainable, green, all of those things, they're actually just a feature of your product in a customer's eyes. They're not the full value proposition. And that's something climate founders consistently get wrong. You have to earn relevance the way that any other product does to win. So like you're not competing against other climate companies for attention, you're competing against everything. And once you accept that, you'll start worrying more about how to be interesting instead of, how do we get people to care about climate? That's the nice knock-on effect, right? You need to be like a useful product first. And then secondly, having that is the thing that makes people it's part of why you choose the more expensive thing versus the less expensive thing, right? It's like, well, that is something I care about, so I'm willing to spend more money on that. And it's worth kind of parsing out B2B to B2B and B2C, because I know a lot of climate companies are B2B as well. In B2B, cost is much more of a driver, like those examples that we brought up earlier, the brick and sort of the plastic company. Risk and compliance, good for the planet can often be a tiebreaker, but not the whole pitch. And in B2C, sustainability rarely sells on its own. So yeah, like we said, you've got to sort of think about why you're relevant in people's lives beyond just that, and not get too caught up in the climate question. It's just a part of what you do. It's not the whole value.
So many of the founders that we speak to and people within our audience will be at different stages along this journey, right? So let's say some of them have done the work, they've started to look at their brand. How do they actually then operationalize that brand, not just commission a logo?
Yeah. So I think the best way, so a criticism of brand work is that, well, you get a lot of smart people to kind of talk about all of this stuff and write it down in a nice deck. And then you hand that deck over and it goes into a drawer or a file on your computer, and no one ever touches it again. And the company just moves on. So it's like, we did this great intellectual exercise that everyone feels really good about, but like nothing happens with it. And, we could have a whole conversation just about this, because this is actually the most critical part of doing this work, is translating it. And it's some of the hardest part of doing the work, translating it now into the day-to-day actions of the company. And the best way to think about that is your brand becomes, yes, it's a North Star for the company. It sort of aligns people around a common cause, a common purpose, but it's a decision filter that the team runs. From everything, even about like, how do we develop our product? You can ask the best way to do this is you sit down with every team in the company and you say, okay, here's what our brand stands for. Here's all of this. Now let's talk about what you do day to day in your job and how this applies to what you do. And the test of when you've done this is like somebody a couple layers down from the founder, from the executive team, the senior team, can make a judgment call, a hire, a cut, write an awkward email, without asking you, then that decision filter is running. So for example, I worked with a company they were a post-raise Silicon Valley company. They're called Cambly, and they are an English language learning app. And, similar to Duolingo, but just for non-English speakers. And, about a year or two ago, when everyone's very buzzy about AI, they've started talking about like, well, how are we going to integrate AI into our product? And there's already been bounce back on this. Like even Duolingo, we saw they integrated an AI chat feature where you're kind of talking to an AI, and they already got rid of it because it wasn't working well. But their whole brand was built around this insight that barrier for people to speak English isn't actually the language. It's like a social fear. And anyone who's tried to learn a new language knows this. The second you go to order a coffee, the second you go to speak in a meeting, like a work meeting, it's not even that you don't know the words. Like you could parrot them back, but you're just afraid you're going to mess up. You're afraid to look stupid in front of people. And so their product was built around like real conversations with real people. So we said, like, look, if you're using brand as a decision filter, it's not that you can't use AI, but you just can't use it to have those conversations, because that sits against the fundamental value that your product brings people and the insight of why it actually works. So they used AI to take notes, to send people follow-ups, lesson plans, things like that, instead of replacing that human contact, which was really the core value that their product brought to people. So when you use brand as a decision filter in this way, it can inform everything from, like we said, an awkward email you have to write, who you hire, to how you end up making decisions about how you're going to build your product and sort of evolve.
Yeah, it's really interesting, the AI piece. I think Will and I have found that actually it's sort of pushed the business back towards more personal relationships, which in our game is what we want. Because I think people are a little bit suspicious about AI and what it can do and what people are using it for. So it is interesting how I think that can really negatively impact your brand if you're going too strong on that stuff, especially in the service well. So you have to use it to your advantage, but not just solely rely on it, right? It's for efficiencies rather than changing how you perhaps communicate and liaise with your customers. And then there's always a question that we like to ask, which is, a little bit more sort of like words of wisdom or advice that maybe you would give to a founder who just closed their first round. Because I think there's an awful lot of things that go through founders' minds about what's the first thing I should focus on. So what are your words of wisdom on that?
Yeah, I'm going to repeat what I said before, which is take those 2 weeks. Spend 2 weeks getting brutally clear about what you do, who it's for, and what painful problem you solve for people. And the clarity you get from that will make every decision you make, every hire you look to make, every pound you spend work a lot harder.
Excellent. Sounds good. Well, look, I think unfortunately we have run out of time, but I think that was a really interesting discussion around that, and I really appreciate your insights.
Glad to be here.
Thanks, Kelli.
Thanks.